Before we start our conversation, I would like to provide our audience with some background about the significant theoretical interventions and disruptions Dr. Nyeck and Dr. Rodriguez are making in Africanizing Queerness. In her book, Africana Queer Presence, through cinematic analysis, Dr. Nyeck offers an understanding of African queer existence that highlights, I quote, the ethics and politics of negotiation. Dr. Nyeck writes, I quote, that while activism and scholarship on queer issues in Africa is on the rise, a non-standardized examination of everyday life as a practice of queer agency and theorizing is also emerging. Corporatist views about human rights, gender, and sexual identities assume that the state or political power alone is sufficient to achieve equality and individual freedom, end of quote. In Dr. Nyeck's work, the queer African subject is first and foremost engaged in inter-relationality, forging a way of being with others, not against them. I agree with Dr. Michael Shwe that in her work, the question is not who queers are, but what queers are doing, negotiating, strategizing, and struggling in transformative neutrality, end of quote. Dr. Rodriguez's book, The Economy of Queer Inclusion, Transnational Organizing for LGBTI Rights in Uganda, provides a detailed account of their personal and intellectual journey as a diasporic Black American Caribbean queer scholar, exploring queer activism in Uganda. They address the pitfalls of, I quote, the internationalized political economy of homosexuality and transnational advocacy. Dr. Rodriguez's book demonstrates how the logic of transnational organizing reproduces the white savior syndrome. Dr. Rodriguez puts race and power back into the conversation. I quote, the transnational is imagined as a space created, occupied, and operated by white Western advocates, end of quote. As a result, we must decolonize the conceptual framework of advocacy and propose something new that allows us to decenter whiteness and place people of African descent at the heart of the struggles that concern them. So my first question to both of you is the following one. What does African queer studies stand for today? Do you have any concerns about the hegemonic shaping of African queer studies that results from the discipline's location within Western academia? So maybe we could start with Dr. Nyeck, then Dr. Rodriguez.
Thank you, Nathalie. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez, for joining us. To the question, what does queer African studies or African queer studies stand for today? It is hard to say, in my opinion, if indeed the subtext to that question is to measure to what extent the everyday life of queer people has been understood, and has theorized, not has been theorized, but the everyday life has theorized and reshaped our understanding of where we're going and what is it that we are doing. By and large, I think we are a little bit caught up in political discourses and institutional assessment of what is and what is not. And that in of itself should not be strange, because the movement or the instances that have galvanized research and activism have been those that are centered around law, basically, and the state. But why, perhaps if I may rephrase that question, why is the everydayness actually important? Because that is where news breaks. That is where the real takes shape. That is where reality, as we live it, is. Where we actually start from not the abstract, not some idea of what a human being is, or what a woman is or is not, or what a male is not. Because at the end of the day, everybody knows what is and is not in one's life. So queer studies had made that kind of entry in the field of Africana studies, but I would say it is still struggling. That is not to say that we don't see scholarship. In fact, there is, I think, some scholarship emerging now where actually people are talking a little bit more about the everydayness of life, the reality on the ground, if you want. But it hasn't gotten to the point of sophistication where that life in of itself is the theory that we embrace, is the lens that afford us the pleasure to engage, not from the point of marginality, because that only suggests the law, the state, but actually from the point of maybe more philosophically as an endowment of a vision, of a way of being, of an ethic that should then spill over to not only society, but the institution. So that would be my take on that question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I will follow up on the everyday life aspect of your work later on. Dr. Rodriguez?
Oh, thank you. So I was thinking about this Angela Davis quote, where she reminds us that we are living in the imaginaries of those long gone before us. And one day, people will be living in the imaginaries that we've created. And so I want to start by highlighting the radical potential of the field. And I think that that is only found within the margins of the field thus far. So to emphasize that there are scholars who are generating really brilliant, very collaborative, very grounded questions and fusing those with insurgent methodologies, reflexive methodologies, etc., that are all in service of creating a life world among some death worlds. With that being said, I think that African queer studies is in this moment perhaps aspirational as a coherent field, whereas there is a burgeoning kind of queer African studies that, from what I see, does have quite a number of LGBT scholarship, not necessarily the merger of queer theory, but of the focus on LGBT subjectivity, individuals, identities, right? Merged with kind of classic social science methodologies. And I think that that particular juncture is one that produces some problematic lenses, relies on a lot of Europeanized or Euro-American questions and sensibilities about what queer Africanness may mean. And I think for me, what I see as a challenge for this hegemonic shaping that you are pointing to is that there's a misreading. I think there's a misunderstanding about identity, where queer and African is just two very separate things, right? Identity categories that for some people happen to connect. And a lot of the scholarship then focuses on this queerness without thinking through Africanness, without thinking through racialization, colonialism, the current realities of coloniality. And I think in that way, when we deracialize queerness, when we separate coloniality from the questions of what, from what emerges queer struggle today, then we fail a movement, we fail a people, we fail the diversity of needs, but also the connection of those needs to the real struggles throughout the continent and the diaspora today. Last little bit though about producing knowledge, I think is really important to emphasize that there is the political economy of knowledge production, right? That relies upon kind of citation building and status building through these very particular institutional, academic mechanisms and metrics, right? Through which the value of people's work derives from their associations with American and European institutions. But I would also say, one thing that queer African studies in particular that I feel is challenged by is by the self-citation and the requirement of citing largely Euro-American scholars in queer African studies as though they are producing the knowledge in this way that just completely ungrounds the work and simultaneously grounds the work, as in it keeps it at a certain level, stopping it from any substantial progress.
Thank you. And just to follow up on that, actually, this is not a secret that I'm going to share. Dr. Nyeck suggested the title, Africanizing Queerness, and I would like us to sit on that for 1 second. And Dr. Nyeck, correct me if I'm wrong, but when I read your work, I see a focus on everyday life. I see a focus on the existential component of queer African life. And there are three paradigms that stayed with me as I read your book: negotiation, reciprocity, and queerness and queer agency. And also I kept on thinking in terms of interrelationality, because as you clearly stated in your work, and one of the critics who wrote some very important words about your work said you're not interested in who people are, but what they are doing. And when I read your work, I see this relationship being with others. So I was wondering if you could explain to us why are the following concepts, negotiation, reciprocity, and queer agency, so central to your understanding and conceptualizing of African queerness?
Yes. My background is political science, or political theory, if you will. And I can say that what we are witnessing talks about queerness, LGBT, and all of that. It's a bit like we are witnessing the battles of the gods, at least, and goddesses. Good versus evil, by and large, no matter how you frame it, whether it is tradition or politics or values, what have you. And personally, I am absolutely not interested in queerness as defined by one's sexuality. I am not interested in that approach. That is not to say it doesn't have its value, or that is not actually the pinnacle of political opposition. I'm just saying that as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't stimulate my mind, at least for a long time. I define queerness as something being out of order, period, as simple as that, right? As something that rises and disappoints. It disappoints expectations. Now, sometimes I find it easy to use religious metaphors and imagery to explain what I'm trying to convey. in the Christian tradition, they talk about the beginning as this dilemma of between, the tree of knowledge. We're talking about knowledge of good and evil. And clearly, if you were to just come after day one, hey, don't eat, this is bad, this is good, you will clearly see a world, or you will imagine some kind of governance that fundamentally rests on that sort of tension. Okay, the role of society, the role of our institutions, the role of our ethics, right, is indeed to organize people around this sort of dichotomy. This is good and that is bad. That's day one. That's like baby steps. But one thing that always intrigues me, it says good end. So when you look at world history, we've always been wrestling with the ending, the thing that actually suggests to us that whether you take side between evil or good, depending on how you define it, whether it was the 15th century with the witches and all of that, or the gays today, actually does not matter. Because it suggests to me that perhaps, maybe, or just maybe, our continuous fight or struggle has always been to define humanity as a new species that can hold in equilibrium the contradictions of the real. That is what we are in the fight for. What kind of ethics, what kind of institutions, what kind of society can we imagine where we finally appreciate those years where we were in this kind of fight, and then we start thinking, what would end mean? What is the ending? What does that mean? It means first and foremost that the idea of defining something as, let's say, the African values is by itself something that is a bit hard for me to understand, because nobody, no country, no culture is a single unit. It's a single branch. It's justice in that. So that is our political structure. And unfortunately, we are at an age where we seem to feel as if that the work is done, has been handed to us. It's over, right? The Catholic Church has figured that out. The politicians have figured that out. The libertarian and all of that, they have figured that out, right? And then we just come and take sides, right? And the queer body presence, all of that, whatever comes with that, to me, is suggesting a new type of species where it is this end that is being put in the middle, recentered, so it can reanimate a different kind of human, a different kind of institution, a different kind of presence, fundamentally. So then, African queerness, for me, then asks or places Africa in that sort of, I'm going to call it a refuge, a shelter, a life-bearing shelter, where we're going to now start thinking about, okay, what is it that makes us and you? Of course, you cannot get out of that place without some sort of a recognition of the other, right? So, and this is why I was very interested in Senghor, in a sense that my reading of his humanity seems to be showing that at the first hour, there is some sort of narrowness, and that is fine, because everybody receives something that is yours first. And then at the second hour, there is something broader that is a lot more beyond me, but not just beyond me, it is with the other. That to me is really the crux of the matter. Whether we're talking internally in terms of politics within Africa, but right now there is a lot of issues going on in Senegal, in South Africa, in the Sudan. These have been our challenges. So it is perfectly fine to get caught up on political statement about we are this, but that this without the other, I don't think it is working very well, even if you put the queer aside. So that's what I would say at this point.
Thank you. And hopefully I have a follow-up question on Senghor, African feminism and womanism later on, but I'm trying to be mindful of time. I'm very selfish. I want to ask all my questions, but I know the audience also have some questions. So Dr. Rodriguez, we all heard the sad news about the recent legislation in Uganda. And I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, you were actually doing field work in Uganda in 2014 when they came up with the first law that was rejected. And once again, although we are aware of the many ways in which right-wing American evangelicals and our failed leaders on the continent are using queerness in a way that promotes state-sponsored homophobia, once again, the single story about African queerness became what happened in Uganda a few months ago. So we must fight against the criminalizing of queerness. But at the same time, what do we make of this one-dimensional narrative where Uganda becomes Africa as a continent and all queer Africans become Ugandans? That's my first question. And what are we missing in the conversation? And also, you can also connect that to your presence there, as a queer diasporic person doing field work, asking some very serious questions. How did you negotiate those boundaries and navigate that space at the time? And how do you reflect on what happened lately?
Yes, all the questions. Okay.
No, basically choose whatever you want.
No. I will attempt to go for this very quickly. I thank you for the question. What is happening? The nationalist project in Uganda right now is incredibly violent and simultaneously relies upon institutional legal mechanisms that reflect coloniality in the space. And I think one thing that happens that is really harmful in these transnational conversations is the settling on the reason for what's happening in Uganda in an essentialized manner, right? As a reflection of these Black homophobias, et cetera, right? And so there's this dehistoricization that happens in that way. But I think there's also, to point to something that you were saying, in the question or embedding in the question, there's also a way where we rely upon colonial spatial imaginaries. So what is a Ugandan, for example, when we're asking, about the homophobic, what does it mean for every African to be a Ugandan, et cetera, when not every Ugandan, not even close to every Ugandan supports these types of projects, right? Or decides or, has any kind of decision-making power within these projects and within the national priorities for the law, right? And so one thing that I was navigating while I was there and what really brought me, I think, in part was being very familiar with the rhetoric, the types of rhetoric that constructs the homosexual threat were things that I found in my childhood, that impacted me when I was younger, were forms of kind of demonizing the queer other that I found familiar and I did not find unbreakable. I don't find it essential. I don't think are just emblems of my people, right? We don't think of each other in these very specific ways. And I think at the same time, to name, Jamaica as the most homophobic place, or think about, you see all of these, the way that those rhetorics, the kind of export of homophobia, of responsibility of homophobia, of the markers of homophobia, et cetera, the way that those happened and continue to happen in the Caribbean are the same ways that those are happening in Uganda. And simultaneously, that export in and of itself foments such a divisive picture, right? Where this becomes these forms of legislation become a counterattack, right, to transnational, to a world system, to an international system of extraction. And so I think one thing that I push toward in understanding, one thing that I think I'm focusing on theoretically is trying to respatialize our kind of queer imaginary, our global imaginary, right, of these politics, so that we're not thinking through these borders so specifically as though they exist in a way that traps ideology, contains ideology, or even grows them. And so that we can further nuance what it means to be in these spaces. So to go to the part of the question where you asked, how I was navigating that, negotiating it. One thing that was really important that I wrote about a little bit in the book was what it meant to be read as a Jamaican person, right? I was called the Jamaican wherever I was going in Kampala, even with perfect strangers, right? And so there were very interesting markers of difference for me that were meant to be phenotypical differences that I hadn't anticipated, and that were associated with assumptions of a shared homophobia for some people, or a shared kind of Black radical politic, or that actually meant I got to navigate the space while experiencing quite a few politics, quite a few publics, quite a few, all at the same time. And for me, one thing that I found was that if we think about space and connection differently, so for example, what does it mean to think through criminalized populations? What does it mean to think through death worlds, right? Like these carceral sites that we are funneled into in New York, right? Where, sure, sodomy is legal, right? And yet, lesbian people of African descent and trans women of African descent, et cetera, are going to be funneled into prison sites, into jails. We've all had experiences with detention, et cetera, right? What does it mean for that not to be a queer question in this space that is signaled as queer friendly, and yet an exclusively homophobic question in this other space? What does it mean to separate anti-Blackness from, these forms of queerphobia that become, these markers of legislation that the world then uses to reproduce world systems violence?
I have so much to say about it, but I can't. As I think about what you said, it's this idea of sexual democracy, equating the democratization process with like sexuality. And by doing that, the Western world presents itself as homophobia free and everybody is included, whereas you have issue of racism, anti-Blackness, and class, which still impact the material conditions of queer people of color who do not fit into a certain kind of paradigm, but also the essentializing of an entire continent and making homophobia synonymous with Africanness. Even in this country, the African-American community is always portrayed as being the most homophobic. So this double process of otherizing and marginalizing and dehumanizing and othering. But anyway, we're coming to an end, but I have one question for Professor Nyeck. In your work, you rely on African womanism, African feminism, and Leopold Sédar Senghor's practical humanism to inform your theorizing of African queerness. If you could just tell us about how those fields of studies, those disciplines in particular, became so important in your reflection, that would be great. And then I will turn to Dr. Rodriguez for some concluding thoughts, and we'll have the Q&A. Thank you.
If we were to ask the opposition or the struggle of queer people, what is it a case of in Africa? The answer for the past 15 years has been bad laws, human rights abuse, etc., etc. But I wanted to think first and foremost and situate this scholarship and center it within broader concerns of African studies. one of the things that happened with the emergence of queer studies is that scholars were talking to other queer theories from here and there, but they were not actually engaging with the central themes. And that by that, I also mean the central figures of African studies. So fine, I can write a book and talk about Foucault and Butler, right? So I actually wanted to show that it can be done, and I wanted to show how. So I didn't just want to critique. So the idea that if we want to take Africa seriously, therefore, we can never start from the premise of something that doesn't engage with Africa as Africa is, and with respect. The idea, you don't negotiate with somebody you don't respect. We sometimes hear that in war against terrorism. I don't negotiate with terrorists, right? So I wanted to, something that would give me that cushion, where I feel not only I'm centering myself within the core of African studies, but I am also showing how queer studies can bring fresh interpretations, fresh insight on things that we think we know. And that is why by pulling Senghor, I also wanted there to gesture towards the fact that most scholarships, or queer scholarships, are really on French, English-speaking countries. And by pulling Senghor and kind of engaging with him, that was my attempt to say, hey, this can be done in different contexts, different languages, French being one of them, at least the Francophone era. So Senghor then becomes important because of his weight on the kind of Francophone imaginary, right? And then Nameka becomes important because not only she's talking about feminism, but she is making provision for the incompleteness, right? You can only negotiate where you think that you are better off with a solution that engages the other person. And that is what I'm talking about, the ending, right? And that is a very queer approach in of itself, right? To hold in equilibrium this idea that, as Wagner would say, right? The spear that wounds might also be the spear that heals. And unfortunately, I have to say, that is where we are. There will never be a queer or queerness without Africa. Africa is always the container, and all other identities, conversations, platforms are the content and not the reverse. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. Some concluding thoughts?
Sure. I agree with Dr. Nyeck on so many points, and I think the number of times that you preempt points that I want to make, even in this short conversation, I love. I wanted to then just echo a piece that I believe differentiates, or why I was saying why Africanizing queer studies, right, becomes an aspirational project. And so, one, I do think that there are a number of scholars who are doing this work, and particularly scholars of African descent doing this work, who are doing it quite differently. And I wanted to just uplift, a few of them particularly. So TJ Talley has a new work, Kwame too as well. Zetu Matupeni, Denaimo Potsa, Sylvia Tamale, Stella Nyansi, Anima Ajapong. There's so many people who are actually bringing in questions into this work that then do this type of work that Dr. Nyeck is saying, right? Of thinking through the appropriate synergies, right? The only synergies that actually can generate a radical future, right? Can generate liberation. And for me, those are the types that connect, that do perhaps this borderless work. I do think that, inherent to a queer project is border defying, is anti-national in many ways. Even if there are forms of nationalism that, of course, are very important to us. So I would say even, Dr. Etoke, your work, right? Thinking through the transnational or thinking through connections quite differently, thinking beyond borders so that we can have the ontological shift, right, that we need, that centers the relationship between gender and Africanness, right, in this way where queerness then becomes a political project rather than any individual sexual or gender identity, right? When we see it as a political project, we get to actually confront the reality of coloniality today. We get to confront these kind of, post-colonial autocratic regimes. We get to confront the forms of legislating that are actually continuing the same principles of division and ways of seeing or dehumanizing people on the basis of, right, on the basis of thinking through kind of rationality in these very particular sexual norms, right, as well as racialized ones, as well as gendered ones, etc. So I think that would just be my final note for now, and I, would happy get into.
Thank you very much. This was awesome. I had so many other questions, but we'll turn to Anthony for the audience questions.
Thank you, Nathalie, and thank you to Dr. Nyeck and Dr. Rodriguez. That was awesome. So I'm just going to get cracking with the first question that's come in. This is from Alice, who asks, I'm interested in how radically Africana queer theory can break with dominant Western queer theory. Where are we likely to find the most similarities, and where do and can the two move in very different directions? Thanks so much for this important conversation. So I'll put that to Dr. Nyeck first, and then we can shift between the three of you from there.
Let me perhaps share my understanding of breaking away, or break. There is an interesting book and conversations these days about what decoloniality means and decolonials. And there is a book by Professor Tao Against Decolonization, who has a very interesting take that I think people should read. This is how I see the world, like I said, right? So we start with us. So when we're starting by talking about human rights, that is day one. That is expected. That is expected. It's not bad. It's good. And at the end of the day, whether we're using a treaty, an international treaty, or language that is out there, right? We just waking up, right? But if we want to be mature and feel that we are not just consuming something, but we can actually produce, we can turn out to be our own subject, and that we can produce knowledge that is not just relevant for us, but also for others, the world, these two dimensions. Therefore, we have to ask the question, what is queer theory? It's not just a matter of where is it coming from? What is it doing? What is the end? What is the end? Now, that context, I would say personally, the economic context, the cultural context, and the political context is one that was not favorable. I don't know there is a country, we have to admit this, there's no country where the queers have just been given a free ride. No, they had to struggle with that. They had to contextualize, they had to fight within the institutions that they know. I think what we're trying to say is that Africa is not different. The problem is that the differences of Africa tend to be hyperbolic. Like you are fixated in one direction and you stay there. So we want to say, in a similar way where people had to struggle, we must struggle. And the result might be not following a theory. It might be, in fact, multiplicities, because we don't have to be the US with two political parties. Maybe multiplicity is good. Maybe complexity is good. Because at the end of the day, the world is so diverse that we cannot possibly just end up with one thing. But the struggle there now is a question of power. Because academia is all about what? Citation and this and that. We know the game. And doing African scholarship within academia, within Northern America, within the European academia, including within Africa, is not a small feat, especially when you're raising question that other people deem not urgent, not a priority, not this and that. So I don't think we should be worried about whether there are intersections or which directions. I think if perhaps it is time to ask, what is it that queer theory find in African ways of understanding queerness? Because that, in my understanding, will be actually a very queer move. It's one thing to say queers are accepted by law, but making them part of the way you think is yet to happen in the West, right? So let us remove homophobia, if you will, at that level. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nyeck. Dr. Rodriguez, any comments either on the original question or on Dr. Nyeck's response to it?
Yeah, you know, what I was just reminded of, and I think was a vein of thought that I had earlier as well, was Toni Morrison's description of the function of racism, where she says the function, the very serious function of racism is distraction, and it keeps you from doing your work, right? Explaining over and over again your reason for being. I think that this impacts the field in many ways, because what Africana, you know, queer theories have to do that is quite different than Western queer theories is that it has to continuously reconstitute its own validity, right? Why are we asking this question? How could you get to this other question before explaining that you indeed exist and in such a number that you're significant, and why is it, it's always why? And so what ends up happening even in the research that we produce is that we continuously have to go back to the very beginning of the question, which is, there are gay people in Africa, you see? And this way of thinking, it is so incredibly limiting, right? That even in this type of scholarship that we can produce, this blended with very perverse ways of taking the question of accessibility, which accessibility projects are you know, politics that I deeply believe in, especially as a Crip scholar. But there's a way that accessibility is oftentimes framed within these racist kind of projects of start from the beginning. How can you be sure that queerness fits the context that you're saying? You see, how can you be sure that the African scholar, right, that you are trying to enter into conversation with would indeed want to converse with you, right, based on these individualistic kind of sexualized, you know, the LGBT taxonomy itself, right? And so the way that interacts with the field then, I think it does limit the types of tools, even those from queer theory, that could and should be applied, right? Because I see queer theory as theorization that contends with, you know, regulatory power, that contends with the structural shapings of the world, the mechanics, right? That are developed in order to suppress, right, or oppress queer knowledge. So that's kind of, you know, what I was thinking with that question in particular.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Etoke, any comments on any of the sort of stream of answers?
Not because I would like our speaker to communicate with your audience, but as I listened to both Dr. Nyeck and Dr. Rodriguez, you reminded me of a concept that I coined, epistemic double consciousness, meaning before you start talking about yourself, you're engaging the Western episteme that has a very specific understanding and definition of the human, which is grounded on your dehumanization. So we constantly, because also of our positionality, I'm not teaching in Douala, Cameroon. I'm located in the Western space, you know, so there's like a double injunction there. Prior to situating yourself, you have to engage the idea that the other has of you, which is a total misrepresentation of who you are. And it's tiring, but there's no way out of it, because when you think about racism and Blackness, with the Western world doesn't make sense if you cannot dehumanize non-white people. So this, I reflected on that, and this idea of epistemic double consciousness is just also at the core of so many of the conversations that we're having. And I'll stop there because I want the speakers to speak.
No, but honestly, that was exactly the line of thought that I was in, thinking about Sylvia Wynter's critique of the overrepresentation of man, and this, autopoiesis through which white, Western, bourgeois, abled, right, the normate may reproduce its image of itself, right, and therefore not make legible the other, I think, particularly the racialized, particularly the queer other. And so what does it mean then? This is the homo nationalist project, right? Is if we can take into account a certain LGBT body that can be close to the norm, right? If we can make this, if we can normativize this, right, and integrate it into state power, then we can actually count for LGBT people in a way that actually reconstitutes the power of the West, right? Because this isn't the new form of delineation that allows for, the African subject or the quote unquote Oriental subject to stay within that barbarism, right? A barbarism that is required in order for the West to be superior, to be coherent, to be white, right? And so that process in and of itself is one that that I think, in particular, the Ugandan legislation is reacting to in the way that it writes, the way it defends culture, the way that it, frames the economy, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you so much. Now, unsurprisingly, this question has popped up in a event that's probably attended by a lot of philosophers. So this is from Andreas, who says, it seems that you all use many different disciplinary resources and methodologies in your work. Is there still a place for the traditional philosopher's armchair, or must the contemporary queer theorist be engaged with the world? It strikes me on the face of it, especially because in your bio, Dr. Rodriguez, it mentions that you rely on engaged methodologies, and Andres used the word engaged, that this is probably a good question to go with you first, and then we can go to Dr. Nyeck after that.
I'm not sure I understand what it means to disengage with the world. But if I can presume, or I don't want to presume, if I can layer maybe places where engagement or disengagement may occur, and the various, my positions on that. I would just say that if a traditional philosopher's armchair sits in a space in which the philosopher himself does not sit, then no, it's probably obsolete. For me, I cannot imagine any useful theory generated from a place of complete disengagement. And so whether that's because you're not from the context, or you've never thought of these questions before, the intellectual intrigue of the moment, and you're not in conversation with people who are pushing that forward, I think that it's unlikely that there is potential for this form of philosophy to meet a liberatory end specifically. Now, is there a place for that philosophy? Of course, because academia will embrace quite happily works that do not affirm or stem from the communities that are embedded in those struggles. So I think there is a place, of course. I just don't believe in that place myself.
Thank you so much. So, Dr. Nyeck, what are your kind of methodological commitments?
I rarely debate methodology, but this is what I could say. Yes, there will be a place for a philosopher from the moon, or all of that, we like it, So, but here's the thing, there is no, I actually want to challenge that idea of an armchair philosopher. So in the past, let's say if you take an anthropologist, right, they wanted to contrast that with oh, we actually go and we have the ownership of the grassroots. But both models, they don't work anymore. What we're saying is that you always engage, and the armchair philosopher, if nothing else, should rethink its relation to that chair and the arms itself. So you are engaged. We are just making you feel understand, because that wood you're sitting on may be coming from Cameroon, where I'm from, right? You know, and don't talk to me about global warming when you are cutting all the forests in my house, in my home, right? And talking to me about grand discourse about, hey, global warming is coming. So there's no such a thing. Somebody is engaged, right? Somebody is engaged. It's not where you are. So if nothing else, rethink your place with that metaphor, right? That arm, those arms and the chair. So that's what I would say.
That's a great answer, and certainly Naomi came in the chat with a big kind of thumbs up to that. Nathalie, do you have any thoughts on the methodology question further to what?
Not really, because I really agree with Lewis Gordon when he talks about disciplinary decadence. So I don't call myself a philosopher or literary theorist. I'm not interested in labeling an identity. I like to think. And whatever tools I need to think, I will use. Dead white males are some of my best friends. I have an entire library here with a bunch of them, from Sartre to Soren Kierkegaard to Camus. And I also have my Africana scholars. And, you know, I don't think in those terms, because this is where we've been trapped since 1492. One way of thinking, one way of being. I come from a place where I am because we are. I need community. My subjectivity only makes sense because I am in relation with other people. I didn't make myself. My parents have to get involved. That's why I'm here. Sorry, Dad and Mom. But you know what I'm saying? It's just like, this is where I'm coming from. So, but I know that in academia, because I'm an academic, they ask you about your methodology. They ask you about your theoretical framework. And I do ask those questions to my students sometimes, but I really want people to think of themselves. And you cannot just think, there's not one way of thinking. And my job is not to advance a discipline. I speak French because my people were colonized by the French. My relationship to French language is not the relationship that an American can have or British can have because they think the language sounds so beautiful. No, I don't. My parents choose not to teach me Douala. So whether I like it or not, I'm stuck with French, you see? And now I'm speaking in English. You know what I mean? It's just like, once we get rid of all those boxes that really prevents us to be in relation with each other, maybe we'll start thinking critically. You know, that's where I'm coming from. But I also understand that Western academia, I mean, even the word discipline, when you discipline a kid, what are you doing?
Right.
You are training and taming someone, and that's the only way, that way or the highway. And that's not my way of being in the world, because to me, it's all about how you are in the world and who you're in relation with. But I think sadly, Western academia has created this situation where you have disciplines that are even colonial disciplines. Anthropology doesn't make sense without the other. I know the field has evolved, but originally, you really need another to study. I'm not studying my brother or my sister.
Right.
I'm trying to understand who they are in their own terms. It's hard, but you know, I centered them first, not me. And that's what I will say.
Yeah, if I could just piggyback off of that, you know, I was thinking the second that you said the discipline, you know, I'm an anti-violence scholar. That's where I'm coming from, is thinking through the question. You know, I think of my work as anti-disciplinary in many ways. Even my work as a parent in some of those ways, as frustrating as that can be. But what I call the methodology of connection in the work, in the book, you know, I think is maybe something worth considering through this always engaged frame. Because if you take something from that, I don't want it to be we're always already engaged and therefore you have nothing to do, right? I think that there are very critical steps that one must take in order to acknowledge what is your relationship to this question, right? What types of insecurities are produced, right? As in, are there gaps in your understanding of your connection? Do you know where that wood is from, for example? How does that place of not knowing shape your questioning, right? How can that maybe show up in your work? I think also if you are a queer scholar, for me, I write about shape-shifting as a queer method. And I think that this is a very important anti-violent practice as well, because managing our visibility in different spaces is actually really important, right? What is being visible versus what do you maybe want to disengage when you're having certain types of interactions? And this might be certain associations, it may be certain politics, it may be queerness, you know, understood as something visibly expressed, et cetera, et cetera. But it is also thinking through what are the spaces of inquiry, right? Who are you connecting to the scholarship, and how are you connecting to the people that you're trying to connect with, right? That you're trying to write with. And so I think that these are the types of questions that we do have to think about deeply, even if you aren't, or I think especially if you're not, you know, using these kind of disciplinary methods. Why stick to one method, right? Why stick to something that some discipline has sanctioned, rather than figuring out the best way to answer the question that you have, right? Which I do think actually requires a very comfortable armchair, but perhaps not only that.